Hi. So last week I was congratulating you on your toughness, and I'm still congratulating you on your toughness because that wind is really a force. And just to get a sense of the audience and its preferences, the question is going to be, do you prefer intense and terrible cold to intense and terrible wind? So all those who prefer intense and terrible cold. Oh, I've never seen that coming. How many prefer intense and terrible wind? Well, you lost. That's it. Okay, well that is totally interesting. I think I grew up in Banning, California, and I have long hair, and I had long hair then, and I spent most of my childhood untangling my hair because Banning is where the pressure from the coast and the interior equalizes, so there's just constant wind. So I'm going for the intense and terrible cold as my preference, I think, for that. How many times today have I? Well, okay. Very close to Rastafarian if I go this way. I'll choose that. Okay, everybody. Well, thank you to our co-sponsors, the Boulder County Commissioners and staff. FrackingSENSE is one part of a big project funded by the National Science Foundation Sustainability Research Network. And, of course, as always, thanks to the Central American West folks who will be wandering around picking up questions at that time. Do tell your friends who are not your equals in toughness and hardiness that they should make a point of checking the Central American West website in order to listen to the podcast or watch the video of tonight's talk. We will, as I've said before, be taking a break and then returning in February with an occasional talk on issues of natural gas development and hydraulic fracturing. We do have some interesting speakers. One I think will be particularly striking. Bermejo Park Ranch, which is owned by Ted Turner. Ted Turner does not own the subsurface rights. So they have had oil and gas development at Ted Turner's ranch there. Ted Turner has a little bit more force or power in life than most surface owners.
But I think he needed a better attorney.
Is that right? Well, okay, well that's important. I'll pass that on to Mr. Turner. Anyway, it looks like we're probably going to be, it's kind of a controlled experiment of a forceful landowner asking for the best practices from an oil and gas company. So I hope we're going to have the ranch manager from the Bermejo Park Ranch, and so, but it will be sporadic and not every Tuesday or anything like that. So if you have ideas about how we can make sure that the word gets out about those upcoming programs, do let us know. And we're expanding. FrackingSENSE is going to be moving to Greeley sometime in February too, where we're just going to be embraced by the whole community. I think everybody's going to be so happy to see us there that we're looking forward to that.
What state are they going to be in?
What state? Well, that's a whole other story. So they are still part of our state, which is great because that means they get to have Colorado River water, which is important because they would have had to give that up with a separate state. So at FrackingSENSE 2.0, as you know, we invite our speakers to provide evidence-based conclusions, findings, recommendations, prescriptions. We pushed for neutrality in the first round of FrackingSENSE 1.0, and now we are letting our speakers quite a bit more off the leash to tell us what they think. Well, not that you would be a person I would try to leash if I were going to do that, so I would not start here if I were going to start.
I didn't realize I had that latitude.
You've always had that latitude, and you live with that latitude, and I would not try to silence you. So I will not be silencing our speaker tonight. That's good news for everybody, and maybe especially for our speaker. So the range of opinions expressed in this series make it essential for us to abide by the recognition that people come to hear these talks. We must do everything we can to make sure that the capacity to hear the speaker remains uninterrupted. So again, respiratory protest. You may sigh with exasperation, you may snort with skepticism, or you may even quietly hiss. If you use the name Hickenlooper, sometimes they need to hiss over that. So they can hiss. The key is you can't harumph, because that is a vocalization that interrupts the capacity to hear, so there's some limits on that. But snoring is not an option either. We do not permit that. Okay. So our speaker tonight, Howard Boigon, is a partner in the Denver office of the law firm Hogan Lovells, where he focuses on transactional, regulatory, and business matters in energy and natural resources law and policy. The diversity of his clients has been striking: oil and gas operators, local governments, and landowners. So we are fortunate tonight to have a speaker who is positioned to benefit from years of involvement with these different groups. It's almost as if you prepared for your speech tonight over your career by moving around to those different groups. And we thank you for living your life in order to be a valued speaker for us. Howard Boigon has served as president and is the current board member of the Colorado Oil and Gas Association. His leadership of professional groups has been striking. He has been a trustee of the Rocky Mountain Mineral Law Foundation, the chair of the Mineral Law section of the Colorado Bar Association, and a member of the advisory board of the Institute for Energy. He was also a principal industry representative in the famed and legendary 2008 Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission rulemaking. He also played a key role in drafting the legislation that attempted to reconcile land development and oil and gas operations in the Wattenberg field. He received his undergraduate and law degrees from the University of Michigan, where his mind was, I'm sure, very sharp before he started that, but was certainly sharpened in interesting ways by that. Because in my decade of hanging around in energy circles, I have often been struck by the insight and liveliness of Howard's perspective on the industry and on the responses of its leaders to criticism and challenge. I know these are sensitive topics, and I know that you will join me in appreciating Howard's willingness to reflect on these matters in a public forum, so that we will thereby be listening closely to his remarks, but you will also be preparing the questions that will launch us into a lively and illuminating and thought-provoking question and answer period. So, ladies and gentlemen, join me in welcoming Howard Boigon, speaking on tradition and innovation in the oil and gas industry, reflections and observations.
Thanks, Patty. Am I live? You can hear me? Great. Okay. So thanks everyone for coming out on this challenging night. I didn't realize how challenging it was going to be. Drove up from Denver. My car flew all over the road. It was challenging to find this place, but it's a beautiful old building. I love being here. And thanks for coming out. So thanks for your gracious introduction. Thanks for what you're doing and what you've always done to promote rational dialogue and constructive engagement on these issues of energy development in the West. Patty's long been our guide on these issues. I'm sure many of you are familiar with her work, What Every Westerner Should Know About Energy, where she described how our intimate connection to fossil fuels in our everyday lives has converged with the immense natural resources of the West to produce cheap energy, boom and bust cycles, and land use challenges of epic proportion. So the conflicts we're experiencing in the Front Range over shale development are really only the latest reel in a long-running movie. But Patty's also our teacher, gently but firmly prodding us to apply the lessons of history to engage thoughtfully and civilly in addressing the current challenges. This series is another in her many attempts to get us to talk with each other about these issues and to try and arrive at constructive solutions. So I'm honored that I've been invited to participate in this dialogue. I wasn't sure how to structure this talk, so Patty tried to give me maximum latitude by coming up with a title that she thought could mean whatever I wanted it to mean. So we have Tradition and Innovation in the Oil and Gas Industry, Reflections and Observations. As I thought about it, I realized that tradition and innovation can help to frame the discussion that I want to have with you tonight, which is to try and put some context around the debate in Colorado on fracking and local regulation, and to offer some thoughts about moving forward toward a rational dialogue on these issues. Of course, I come at this subject with what some might think are insuperable handicaps. I am, first of all, a lawyer, which may raise in some minds the question whether I may be trusted to tell the truth as it exists or as I want you to see it. Second, my trustworthiness is further compromised by the fact that I represent the oil and gas industries, the frackers. My clients want to frack you. How can you possibly believe anything that I would say? I will tell you, as Patty mentioned, that I do represent landowners, conservation organizations, and local governments in addition to the industry, so I like to think that I have a broader perspective. I'm also a pretty reasonable guy. But at the end of the day, you'll have to decide if what I say is credible. So what is fracking anyway, and why are we talking about it? By this time, you are undoubtedly all fracked out. Sorry, it's the last time I'm going to use that. You've heard many speakers in this series tell you everything you could possibly want to know. What I would like to suggest, though, is that we step back and try to frame our discussion by defining our terms. I'll get to tradition and innovation somewhere down the line. In a recent article, Amy Jaffe, who's the Executive Director of Energy and Sustainability at the University of California, Davis Graduate School of Management, noted that in a 1984 textbook called Fundamentals of the Petroleum Industry, hydraulic fracturing or fracking is defined as follows. 1984 textbook. Modern fracturing uses pressured water, gels of various types, and other fluids that are compatible with the formation and hydrocarbons to inject tons of fluid thousands of feet into the earth at nearly unimaginable pressures, great enough to lift and break up the producing formation. When the fracturing pressure is removed, overburdened pressure reasserts itself and sometimes reseals the formation as tightly as before. The contractor, therefore, pumps a propping agent, usually sand, down the hole with the fluid. It props tiny fractures open against formation pressure when the fracturing pressure is gone. Sounds pretty clinical. In 1984, fracking had no political meaning, but was strictly a technical oil field term and referred to a downhole completion procedure. When people use the term fracking today, it tends to take on a broader meaning, both operationally and politically, even though hydraulic fracturing itself still has the same technical meaning and is done in much the same way as described 30 years ago. Operationally, the word fracking now commonly refers to the use of hydraulic fracturing with horizontal drilling to develop oil and gas shale formations, which are generally massive, relatively thin formations of highly impermeable rock. The process involves extending deep vertical wells through lateral pathways in the shale formations for distances of up to a mile or even more, and fracking many times along the length of the wellbore in order to produce oil and gas from the entire length of the lateral wellbore. Although fracking is only a part of the process, it often is used as a shorthand for the development of these shale resources. Politically, the term has a much more charged connotation. It tends to be used to describe, usually with sinister implications, adverse impacts of oil and gas development on human health, safety, and welfare, generally in populated areas. In its most pointed form, it's used to describe in a pejorative way the injection of known carcinogens underground which can percolate into groundwater with the resulting production of large quantities of toxic fluids which are often spilled on the surface before having to be disposed of in underground wells that cause earthquakes. Even more broadly, fracking is used to generally refer to the entire range of activities associated with drilling oil and gas wells in areas in and near where people live, from the initial clearing of roads to the drilling and completion of wells to the installation of tanks and pipelines to store and carry production. Usually, when used in that broader way, there's no distinction made between vertical and horizontal wells, or the single fracking operation that accompanies vertical wells, and the multi-stage fracking that characterizes horizontal wells. Generally, when these broader political meanings are used, it's accompanied with the charge that all of this is unregulated because the state agency is understaffed and in the pocket of industry, and the federal government has abdicated any meaningful role through the infamous Halliburton loophole. So, in the debate over fracking, one's position tends to be defined by how one uses the term. As Professor Jaffe notes, if we could be clearer about what the word fracking is shorthand for, then at least we can have an intelligent dialogue on what fracking means to each of us personally and what shale oil and gas means for our country, pro or con, depending on one's vantage point. From industry's perspective, there's no legitimate issue here. Hydraulic fracturing has been done at over 1 million wells for over 60 years with no confirmed incident of groundwater contamination. Over 99% of the volume of frac fluid is water and sand with a minute amount of chemical additives that are injected into microfractures in the rock thousands of feet below drinking water supplies. Here in Colorado, virtually all of the vertical wells that have been drilled over the past 20 years or more, all over the state, have been hydraulically fractured, some of them several times, with no demonstrated impacts to groundwater. Wells have been drilled and fracked in and around local communities for decades with no discernible public health impacts. Greeley alone has seen over 400 wells drilled in the past 20 years within its city boundaries with no apparent adverse public health impact. In a summary of industry's view on the subject, Professor Jaffe points out that many of the environmental risks currently associated with shale fracking are in fact risks that also exist in all kinds of drilling for oil and gas wells, and even for wells drilled for geothermal energy. She notes that all wells have casing, not just shale wells. All oil and gas wells have some amount of methane leakage. This is not unique to fracked wells. Even very deep drinking water wells run the risk of bringing up radioactive materials from the ground, as has become a growing health threat in India. Imperfectly located wastewater disposal wells of all kinds risk seismic instability issues, an issue not related specifically to the underground fracking itself, but to the wastewater disposal sites. Fracking, in this view, is only a relatively minor part of the process of drilling and completing a well and does not itself present a threat to public health. Similarly, industry has no patience with the notion that the practice of fracking specifically or the drilling of wells generally is unregulated. To the contrary, the oil and gas industry is subject to comprehensive state and federal regulation in all aspects of drilling and development, including hydraulic fracturing. At the state level, Colorado has led the way over the past 20 years, eliminating industry's dominance on the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission, I'll refer to that as the COGCC, and conducting several major rulemakings that have elevated the importance of public health, safety, and welfare to equal stature with resource development in the COGCC's decisions. Colorado rules are the toughest and most comprehensive in the country by far. Here's a quick review. They have a permitting system that provides for public participation and consultation with surface owners, state agencies, and representatives of local communities in which drilling is occurring in order to assure protection against identified threats to public health, safety, and welfare. The rules have requirements for groundwater testing, minimum setbacks of at least 500 feet from occupied buildings and other designated surface uses, and best practices designed to minimize impacts for locations that are within 1,000 feet of buildings and other surface uses. There are extensive rules governing casing and cementing of wells to protect groundwater aquifers, the containment and disposal of produced water and other exploration and production waste, limits on noise, light, and odors from drilling operations, safety of drilling operations, protection of wildlife, protection against stormwater runoff, and required reclamation of drill sites. Specifically with respect to hydraulic fracturing, the rules require disclosure of chemicals, approval of the proposed fracking program, and monitoring to assure that the wellbores maintain adequate integrity during the fracking process. Both the Federal Safe Drinking Water Act and Clean Air Act apply to oil and gas operations in Colorado through regulations of the COGCC and the Health Department, which must meet federal standards. There are many other federal, state, and local requirements applicable to drilling operations. The point is that, in fact, oil and gas activity in Colorado and elsewhere is, in fact, highly regulated, and, in fact, especially so in Colorado, and is intensively scrutinized for its compliance, more so now than ever. In light of all this, industry has tended to dismiss the controversy over fracking as a manufactured one, trumped up by industry opponents as an excuse to ban oil and gas development. While there is undoubtedly some truth to that, it does not adequately account for very real concerns felt by many people regarding the impacts of this industrial activity in their neighborhoods and near their drinking water. There's no doubt that oil and gas drilling and development has impacts on its surroundings, like any other industrial activity. And there's no reason that oil and gas should get a pass from satisfying the public that it is adequately mitigating or avoiding those impacts. Much of the current controversy in Colorado stems from industry's failure to convince the public, at least the public in certain communities along the Front Range, that adequate protection is in place or is enforced. So we have moratoria, bans, and a move in some communities toward comprehensive local regulation intended to fill perceived gaps in protection of the public welfare. Industry tends to think this is just a matter of messaging, that giving people the true facts will lead them inevitably to the right answer, that fracking poses no risk. I don't think it's anywhere near that easy. A study just announced by Resources for the Future tested attitudes on shale development among test groups in Texas and Pennsylvania and found, not surprisingly, that it was difficult to change people's minds if they were already made up, even when they were given additional information. Among those who were still ambivalent, NGOs were much better than industry at swaying opinions. People tend to process information in terms of how they see the world. Harvard instructor David Ropeek gave a fascinating talk at the Rocky Mountain Energy Summit last August called The Risk Perception Gap. He's also written a book, which I highly recommend. He summarized findings of social science researchers who demonstrated that feelings matter more than facts in driving behavior, and that facts are analyzed by each person based on biases, fears, and assumptions hardwired into patterns of thinking shaped by a variety of forces, including in particular views of groups with which the person most closely identifies. So-called communitarians, for example, those who tend to believe we're all in this together, believe much more strongly in the threat of global warming and the need to take action to deal with it, while individualists, who tend to believe in individual choice and less government as the way to solve problems, i.e. oil men, are much less receptive to the global warming threat. The same dichotomy showed up in reactions to perceived risks of fracking. Risk perception is subjective. Information alone does not close the gap. It may even widen it by tending to confirm the views of the person receiving the information who filters it within his own risk assessment framework, shaped by emotions and group identities. So how do you close this risk perception gap? Ropeek suggests that you do this through actions that demonstrate an understanding of and respect for the feelings of other parties and foster more constructive relationships. So how do we bridge this gap between industry attitudes and public concerns on fracking? To me, it starts with clearing away the distortion, fog, hysteria, misinformation, defensiveness, and self-righteousness that passes for the current discussion and identifying the real issues that require solutions. Those issues center around the increasing impacts of oil and gas development on our communities. Industry needs to recognize that those impacts are real and needs to support efforts to minimize those impacts. At the same time, the stakeholders affected by oil and gas development need to be receptive to the facts surrounding oil and gas development, including fracking, and need to have trust in the system that their concerns will be recognized and protected. And those who have other agendas need to be honest about those agendas so they can be debated and tested in the marketplace of ideas and can inform the larger policy decisions that determine the course of energy development. History gives us some reason to think that the current conflicts can be resolved. Here's also where I think we can talk about tradition and innovation in the oil patch to give us some perspective. It's true that the oil and gas industry has a traditional way of doing things. It's an industry that in many ways is bolted to the past. Things are done certain ways because they've always worked or because that is always the way they were done. A stubborn reliance on property rights as the sacred foundation of the industry underlies attitudes and actions. Oil and gas is found where it is found. Therefore, we must go and get it, wherever it is. And our right to do so is inalienable and must be protected. The rule of capture is the guiding principle, harking back to common law days and wild beasts. Independence and self-reliance, the willingness to take risk, and aversion to interference by government or neighbor. These are the attributes of the oil man. I say oil man intentionally because it has not historically been an industry populated by women. Even as that changes, the attitudes do not. Female landmen are still landmen. Oil men are competitive, notoriously self-confident, sometimes to the point of arrogance and dismissiveness, believing they best know how to do their business and that there is nothing they can't do. What about innovation then? How can an industry so inward-looking, some would say hidebound, be associated with creativity and the cutting edge? The fact is that the oil and gas industry is one of the most innovative on the planet, and our civilization has benefited greatly from this. Think about the basic technology of the business. Drilling a hole several inches in diameter, miles below the surface, to targets imperfectly identified through virtually impenetrable rock under conditions of high heat and pressure, under surface conditions ranging from extreme cold to thousands of feet of water, to dense jungle, to challenging topography, to fragile environments, to urban surroundings, in political and regulatory contexts all over the world, ranging from highly developed to primitive. The imperatives of meeting these challenges have generated extraordinary creativity and innovation, from deep water platforms to multi-well pads to horizontal drilling to multi-stage hydraulic fracturing to pitless drilling to water recycling to fracking without fresh water, to name just a few. Technology is constantly evolving. You give them a challenge, and they figure out a way to meet it. Tradition and innovation show up in Colorado's history of dealing with conflicts over oil and gas development. As our historian leader has shown us in her writings, conflicts over energy development in the West are as old as the hills. History would tell us that these things go in cycles. They flare up in reaction to new or intensified industry activity, and then they die down. So is this deja vu all over again? Or are things different this time? The answer is yes, it is both. Colorado has been experiencing these fights for many years, but there are new elements in the current battles that may make this different. Here in Colorado, we have unique factors contributing to the intensity of the argument. Colorado provides a perfect storm of competing and often irreconcilable land uses. Environmentally sensitive landscape and habitat, abundant wildlife, broad-ranging outdoor recreational opportunities, fast-growing communities, prolific agriculture, split mineral and surface ownership, significant federally owned land and national forest, substantial extractive industry, and a rapidly growing renewable and alternative energy industry. These clashing interests have long fueled fights over oil and gas development. So what's new about the present battles? Let's look at some history. In the Denver Basin, as I previously mentioned, wells have been hydraulically fractured for many years. However, 20 years ago, there was intense conflict over oil and gas development centered in Weld County, and it had nothing to do with fracking. It had much more to do with virtually unrestrained drilling, driven by federal tax credits for developing so-called tight sands of the Codell and Niobrara formations. It was truly a Wild West mentality. Wells were being drilled as fast as operators could get them down, partly because of their flush production, which quickly declined, and partly because the tax credits were due to expire. The COGCC allowed ever denser spacing from one well per 160 acres to 80 acres to 40 acres, putting great stress on farms and other surface uses. Wells were drilled everywhere. Even one was staked in a schoolyard. Turns out it was the school that the Montfort's kid attended, so it attracted quite a bit of attention. The well was ultimately not drilled. The COGCC was not much of a traffic cop, largely confining itself to spacing and pooling decisions. The opposition 20 years ago was led by farmers and ranchers, many of them just surface owners without mineral ownership. And their concerns were driven by their lack of say on location and timing of operations, by the damages they suffered from the loss of use of their land, and also by the environmental damage that this frenetic activity sometimes caused. During this period, the city of Greeley tried to ban drilling in the city limits, an action that was struck down by the Supreme Court in 1992 in the Lunval case on constitutional preemption grounds. In the southwest part of the state, in response to a ramp-up in coal bed methane development, La Plata County exercised its land use authority to enact a new oil and gas ordinance that gave the county broad planning and permitting powers. First time this had been done in the state. The Supreme Court upheld the county's right to do that, also in 1992, in the Bowen Edwards case. The two cases came down the same day. The court recognized a role for local authority so long as it did not present an operational conflict with state regulations, to be determined through an evidentiary hearing. So the basic legal framework on the balance between state and local authority to regulate oil and gas was established in 1992. A local community could regulate land use matters in connection with oil and gas development, but could not ban the activity. The farmers in Weld County and the citizens of La Plata County did not see the COGCC as an effective regulator. And in fact, it was not. So in 1994, the legislature made clear the authority of the COGCC to protect public health, safety, and welfare, and the COGCC conducted the first of a series of rulemakings to implement this authority and take a more active role in protecting health, safety, welfare, and the environment. As state regulation toughened, industry operating practices improved, and industry became more sensitive to the need to address stakeholder concerns. Things quieted down in Weld County, and the relationship between industry and stakeholders in Weld County has become a positive one. The next surge of industry activity occurred on the western slope in the late 1990s and into the 2000s, with wells being drilled on as little as 10-acre spacing and generating public outcry. Although farmers and ranchers were heard with familiar complaints, this time they were joined by environmentalists, since drilling was occurring in areas of environmental sensitivity and abundant wildlife. Local communities were not at the forefront of the opposition, but local authorities struggled to reconcile the competing land use interests. The battles in the Piceance Basin ultimately drove the significant overhaul of the COGCC in 2008 that removed industry's majority on the commission and required more attention to stakeholder concerns, including the toughened permitting standards that I outlined earlier. Conflict in the Piceance has ebbed, partly as a result of the new rules, but also largely through the deployment of new technology, allowing many wells to be drilled from a single pad, and through the use of pipelines for massive water recycling, which have significantly reduced surface impacts. However, before the ink was dry in the new rules, a whole new fight was kicked off by the horizontal Niobrara play that began in 2009 here in the Denver Basin. Companies moved up and down the Front Range, taking leases, and a whole new level of drilling activity ensued, raising the specter of intensive new drilling in and around subdivisions, many of which themselves had not existed only a few years earlier. Citizens concerned about this ramped up level of activity were also being told that wells were being drilled with a new and frightening technology. Fracking entered the public lexicon as citizens became concerned about the public health effects of this perceived new technology. Once again, there was a regulatory response in the form of new COGCC rules requiring disclosure of frac fluids and increasing setbacks and required groundwater monitoring. However, local opposition groups in some communities believe that these regulatory responses at the state level do not adequately protect their communities. This has led to the effort to oppose permitting moratoria or ban fracking or take a more active role in regulating oil and gas at the local level, which both the state and industry fear would result in an inability to continue viable operation, especially if expanded to counties statewide. So what lessons can be applied from the previous conflicts to help us assess the current ones? It's clear that these conflicts occur as industry moves into new areas, especially areas of environmental or human sensitivity, and that the inevitable backlash drives regulatory and technological change. It's also clear that conflicts intensify as a direct correlation to the intensity and insensitivity of industry conduct. But it's also clear that as industry and stakeholders and regulators constructively engage, the conflicts tend to moderate. Over the past 20 years, industry sensitivity to the need to engage with stakeholders has increased considerably, and the state regulatory system has become quite sophisticated, much more suitable for a modern world. It's by Mario Rubio, interlude. I should have put it over there where I had to go grab
Yeah,
it.
where you can.
However, there are differences in the current situation that warrant noting. For one thing, the state has sued a city over its oil and gas rules and fracking ban. That has never happened before. It's an indicator of the stakes involved. The state sees these local bans and regulations as a real threat to its primacy in regulating oil and gas, and as a threat to the ability of the industry to conduct its business. Another major factor that's different now is that the political climate has changed. Colorado has a Democratic governor and a legislature under Democratic control, an unusual political configuration for the West and for a major producing state. Polling shows, and the recent local elections confirm, that Democrats are much more sympathetic to the anti-fracking position. Ironically, this governor is a strong industry ally because of his industry background, but even he has supported tougher rules on setbacks, water handling, well casing, and methane emissions, And of course, any Democratic successor is not likely to have his fondness for the industry. The legislature is increasingly made up of urban representatives who have little understanding of and less sympathy for industry's arguments, even though it could be argued that shale development is a boon for their constituents, urban consumers, and especially the urban poor, who benefit from low oil and natural gas prices to run their cars and heat their homes. Another difference in the current environment is that the debates in Colorado are being fueled by outside groups having a national agenda. In part, the issues here are part of a larger controversy, a national controversy, over the use of fracking and the health impacts of oil and gas development. In part, the opposition is driven by a concern that development of massive domestic fossil fuel resources, including cleaner burning natural gas, will delay or even prevent our transition to a carbon-free economy. Groups like the Sierra Club with its Beyond Natural Gas campaign, Food and Water Watch, 350.org, Clean Water Action, see Colorado as fruitful for bold anti-industry initiatives. Local group of activists, fractivists, some of you probably are in this room, have sprung up to further their anti-industry cause. They are adept at framing issues in graphic ways that stoke public concern at an emotional level. They are organizing and funding local opposition. They are very effective at using social media to spread information and mobilize opposition. They're finding more receptive audiences in fast-growing communities with populations that have increasingly not grown up in Colorado and don't share the appreciation for the long history and important role of the extractive industries in driving our economy. Here in Colorado, as in other parts of the country, industry was slow to recognize the challenge presented by the opposition to fracking, and thus lost control of the debate. Industry, as is its tradition, was dismissive and defensive, incredulous that anyone could seriously contend that this practice constituted a human health risk. Industry resisted calls for disclosure of the chemicals being injected in the fracking operation, fueling the public perception that industry had something to hide. The so-called Halliburton loophole in the Energy Policy Act of 2005, which really only confirmed a long-standing regulatory position that fracking was not intended to be regulated under the underground injection control provisions of the Federal Safe Drinking Water Act, gave the opposition an effective rallying card around industry's perceived freedom from regulation. At the same time, industry began leasing and drilling in the populous areas of the Northeast United States, which mobilized environmental opposition and media coverage in a massive way. The result is that fracking has become the galvanizing force behind a very effective anti-industry campaign. It's resulted in a 5-year moratorium on fracking in New York State, which shows no signs of being lifted anytime soon, and it poses a real threat to industry in Colorado that must be taken seriously. There is discussion of a proposed statewide ballot initiative to ban fracking, or one to increase local control of oil and gas, either of which industry fears would effectively shut down the industry in this state. Even without a statewide initiative, local bans and moratoria present a clear threat to industry's ability to conduct its business in a cost-effective manner with the certainty required to justify substantial capital investment. Industry needs to maintain the legitimacy conferred by political and community support and recognize that this is just as much a part of the bottom line as the cost of steel pipe and frac fluids. So what are the actions that industry can take in order to begin to change the risk perception gap identified by David Ropeik? For one thing, industry should not be dismissive and defensive in responding to its critics. This is not to say that industry should not vigorously defend itself against those who simply want to shut it down, for whom no modification or engagement will ever be enough. But moms concerned about the health of their children need to be persuaded that their concerns are being addressed. It is not enough to say that there is no demonstrated case of groundwater contamination caused by fracking, or that property rights trump all other rights. Property rights are, after all, creatures of the political system and subject to the police power, both for their enforcement and for their legitimacy. Protection of public health, safety, and welfare will always take primacy in determining the scope of property rights. And political support is a critical element in striking the balance and generating the consent of the governed. Industry needs to do a better job of educating and informing the public about its activities. This should include ongoing dialogue with political leaders, business and community leaders, educators, and citizen groups. But more than dialogue is required. Industry has come a long way over the past 20 years in its sensitivity to local concerns and its work with impacted stakeholders, but it needs to do even better. Industry representatives at all levels, including field employees who live and work in local communities, need to be actively engaged with these communities to understand and address their concerns. Industry should take a more active role in supporting the local communities in which they operate by mitigating social and other impacts of their activities. Industry needs to integrate notions of social justice into its planning and operations and operate on the principle that basic notions of fairness and consideration for the interests of impacted stakeholders are just as important as the bottom line in creating a sustainable business environment. Industry also needs to look for opportunities to work collaboratively as an industry to get out in front and work with regulators to develop approaches that help to build public trust. Industry should be more supportive of efforts to limit drilling in areas of particular sensitivity. This includes populated areas. There needs to be special consideration for the impacts of this industrial process on people's lives. This involves restrictions on locations and utilization of best practices. These will impact the bottom line and will result in limitations on property rights, but it needs to be regarded as a necessary cost of doing business and as a recognition that stakeholders have property rights too and rights to health and safety. Industry needs to support the generation of credible studies that document the effects of industry activity. 2 such studies are underway in Colorado. An air quality study conducted by CSU and a National Institute of Health sustainability study led by the University of Colorado in collaboration with other academics and scientists. Professor Limerick is the spokesperson for the CU study. These studies need to be objective, rigorous, and peer-reviewed, not agenda-driven, and if they are, industry needs to be prepared to support them and to adjust practices to respect their findings. However, there is another side to the equation. The anti-industry forces need to be equally responsible. The opposition to industry is in significant part based on agendas that do not necessarily lend themselves to reasoned debate. The fractivists are not interested in constructive solutions. They want oil and gas banned. For example, as reported recently by New York Times columnist Joe Nocera, the Mountain West Regional Director for Food and Water Watch dismissed the proposed new Colorado rules on methane emissions as just a smokescreen designed to fool the public. EDF was giving industry a, quote, veneer of respectability. He added that, "We believe that fracking is inherently unsafe and should be banned." There's no talking to this guy. In the service of the goal of ultimate ban, any tactic is rationalized. This can range from spreading erroneous information, think flaming faucets, to the use of intimidation and even threats to personal security. The head of KOGA has been personally threatened, and pictures of her children posted online, along with an identification of the school her children attend, in an obvious attempt to intimidate and incite violence. Last year at a hearing of the Boulder County Commissioners, an industry representative was threatened and harassed by activists who followed her to her car and then followed her car, causing her to be in fear of her personal safety. Industry representatives are routinely shouted down at public hearings and accused of monstrous crimes. Banning fracking, of course, would effectively ban virtually all oil and gas drilling in Colorado, which would have a devastating impact on our economy, all in the name of protecting the public against an activity that most objective observers believe to be perfectly safe. Policy determinations need to be made on the basis of fact, not fear-mongering. There are certainly legitimate policy questions presented by the surge in shale development. What are the environmental impacts? How can they be mitigated effectively, and at what cost? To what extent will shale development enhance or retard our transition to a carbon-free society? How quickly can that transition be made, and at what cost? Is the public prepared to pay that cost? What are the trade-offs? Do the fractivists want to engage on these issues and have a rational policy debate? Or do they want to frighten the public into unquestioning acceptance of their views without regard to the facts. Hydraulic fracturing has brought undeniable benefits to this country. Low natural gas prices resulting from prolific new shale development have helped to fuel a resurgence of manufacturing. Low natural gas prices benefit low-income consumers in keeping their heating costs low. Converting power plants to cleaner burning natural gas has reduced greenhouse gas emissions in the U.S. to levels not seen in 20 years. With respect to oil from shale development, the picture is similar. According to the Energy Information Administration, the U.S. is now producing more oil than it is importing for the first time since February 1995. Under current projections, the U.S. will be the largest producer of crude oil in the world by 2015, surpassing Saudi Arabia and Russia, with massive implications for our economy, our balance of trade, and energy security, not to mention foreign policy. The boom in U.S. oil production from shale plays has even made the Keystone Pipeline much less necessary to the U.S., giving rise to the notion we could be exporting some of the Keystone oil to Mexico since we don't need it. In this state, studies by the CU Business School and others have confirmed the industry's multi-billion-dollar contribution to state revenues, over $500 million of which is to use non-potable water for fracking and to use chemicals that do not raise public health concerns. New tracers are coming on the market, which will make it easier to identify the source and type of groundwater contamination. Drilling technology continues to evolve, reducing the industry footprint. Methane emissions will be identified and controlled. This industry excels in meeting tough technical challenges. We can hold it to high standards, and it will figure out a way to meet those standards. If we go about this the right way, it will cooperate in setting those standards. Other countries are looking to the U.S. and considering development of their shale resources, not only for the technology, but also for how we resolve the debate here. As the Christian Science Monitor recently put it, will this be a dialogue among listeners or a Washington-style clash of power plays? We all love to live in Colorado, and we have a history of creatively and collaboratively addressing the challenges of our complicated state. There's no reason to think we can't do so on this issue. And with that, I'm happy to take questions.
We'll start, I think we'll keep starting this little section, which is on community impacts and community responses and local control. I think this is a question that was written early, so I think you've covered all this, but I'll just ask it, so if you...
See if I give the same answer.
Yeah, see if you can remember what you said and say it again. And a little bit, I might need a little help with the writer to get this right, but what are the legitimate impacts to communities of oil and gas drilling? And I'm not totally able to say exactly legitimate and whose point of view that would be. What are the legitimate impacts to communities of oil and gas drilling that need to be addressed?
Legitimate impacts can be construed in a couple of different ways. It's almost like that legitimate rape comment that got that guy in trouble last year.
It's not like that.
Impacts, impacts, I mean, look, you can look at impacts as always negative, right? It's an industrial activity, it's going to have bad impacts. It's going to foul the air, it's going to create traffic problems, it's going to generate loud noises. Anything it does will be an impact. I mean, that's one way you can look at it. So in that sense, there's never any legitimate impacts. They're all illegitimate. They're bad. You can say that it's got positive impacts in generating tax revenues, in contributing oil and gas to the greater energy economy. We're all part of the energy world. We use oil and gas in our everyday lives, from running our cars to making our cell phones. Pretty much our clothes, everything we use is based one way or another on oil and gas. So by having oil and gas in our community, we contribute to the common good. That's pretty abstract, that's pretty theoretical. Most people don't want to think that they're the ones who bear the burden of benefiting everybody else. But as an industrial activity, it's a legitimate positive activity. It does generate revenues, it does generate jobs, and if it's done the right way, as I've said for the past 45 minutes, it can be done in a way that minimizes adverse impacts. So when you ask a question, what are the legitimate impacts, it's kind of hard to answer that question. It's sort of a loaded question. Again, it sort of depends on your point of view, whether oil and gas is a good thing or a bad thing. But it's always going to have impacts. There's no doubt about it. And our challenge, our task, is to minimize the bad impacts, the adverse impacts, make them go away to the extent possible, mitigate them, avoid them, control them, while allowing the activity to occur. And I guess I'll say one other thing. When we talk about local governments, local communities, we're talking about communities at all levels. We're talking about small towns, and we're talking about counties. Counties have governments. Counties are their own governing divisions of the state. So impacts have activity. Oil and gas activity has different impacts depending on the type of community that you're in, and so it's a pretty hard question to answer.
Okay, since you enjoyed that impact question, how about another one here? Do the benefits of hydraulic fracturing outweigh the negative impacts caused by hydraulic fracturing? And I suppose I would say, what would be the gauging or the system of calibrating that, and who would be the body or the individuals or who would weigh that?
I just really spent the last 45 minutes talking about this.
Well, these people have been writing questions.
I'm not trying to be negative. I'm just saying that it's hard to give a quick answer to that. Hydraulic fracturing is a specific process. It's an activity that occurs in connection with drilling oil and gas wells. So if you think that it's a good thing to be drilling oil and gas wells, and if you think shale development is a good thing, then you think hydraulic fracturing is good. And whatever impacts it has are outweighed by that greater good. If you're next to a well that's being drilled and being fracked, and it's they're making all kinds of noise and keeping you up at night, you're not thinking about the greater good. You're thinking about the fact that you can't sleep. So it kind of depends on your perspective and on how, whether you're asking it from sort of the greater perspective of oil and gas development, or from the specific perspective of the drilling of a particular oil and gas well.
Should towns and cities and counties be able to ban drilling and fracking? Why no or why yes?
Well, to me that's a clear no. And counties, to me, are the real issue, because if you could ban oil and gas drilling in a county, you're effectively banning oil and gas drilling in the state. I see a different argument, not from a legal perspective, although there are some potential nuances there as well, between looking at smaller communities and the disproportionate impact of oil and gas development on those communities, or at least in areas of those communities, as compared to a county, which will have broad open areas. And so if you start talking about banning, you're literally talking about shutting down the industry. Do we want to shut down the industry in the state? Some people think, yes, we should. Okay, that's your point of view. It's not my point of view. I think it's a legitimate activity. It generates huge economic benefit for this state, and it can be done in a way that does not have adverse impacts, or at least those impacts can be mitigated. So I don't believe in bans, but I do think that local communities should have a say in how and where those activities are conducted, and I think there are areas that shouldn't be drilled, no doubt about it.
Okay, on the Greeley decision, 1992 Supreme Court ruling, this may be something that you have covered sufficiently, but please comment on the relationship between that 1992 ruling in Greeley and the current citizen-backed initiatives in Fort Collins, Boulder, Lafayette, and Broomfield.
Well, look, the conventional thinking in legal circles is that these local initiatives that ban fracking can't survive the Greeley decision. The Greeley decision was pretty clear. Greeley did literally ban all drilling within the city limits. Interestingly enough, the operator in that case had gotten a permit from the city to drill, and then there was a local citizens initiative to put a measure on the ballot to ban drilling in Greeley, and the measure passed. And so the operator challenged that initiative in court and won. And so it's pretty much cut and dried from the perspective of most of the lawyers that, at least the industry lawyers who've looked at this, that local bans can't survive the Greeley decision. Moratoria, you could argue fall into a different position, but moratoria, especially those that are indefinite and those that are extended, begin to look a lot like bans. So, and when you add to that the fact that an operator can get a permit from the state to drill a well, and a moratorium from a local community says, well, we're not going to process your local permit, you're saying that the local community can prevent an activity that the state has authorized. So in that sense, it looks a lot like the Greeley decision. I would say that the Greeley decision is pretty clear and that the local bans won't survive based on pretty straightforward preemption law.
So setbacks. How do you account for oil and gas drilling near two schools in Greeley if the industry, well, excuse me, let's just go with that one for right. How do you account for oil and gas drilling? How does that fit into the loop? Is that a loophole in the 500-foot setback in the regulations? How does it happen that oil and gas drilling is taking place so close to schools?
It shouldn't be. I'm not sure what the situation is. The setbacks were changed effective August 1, but even before August 1, they were 350 feet in so-called high-density areas. And the data showed, the Oil and Gas Commission collected data to show that in most cases, the setbacks in urban areas were a lot farther than 350 feet. So I'm not familiar with specific facts of drilling near a school. It's not good to drill near a school. I mean, it's pretty simple. It's for all kinds of reasons. So I'm not going to stand up here and try to justify it.
Okay, well this will be very fast. In your opinion, does drilling 350 feet away from a grade school represent responsible energy development? No, it does not, you have said.
I wouldn't do it, and I wouldn't counsel anyone to do it.
I should say, for background on this one,
And you can't do it now, but...
when George King was here, he concluded with, from Apache, he concluded with like 12 or 13 questions he thought that surface owners should ask companies before they proceed. So this is a little bit in that spirit. If you were living 500 feet from a fracking site, what would be your strongest concerns?
That's an interesting question. The fracking operation itself lasts a few days. It depends on the type of well and how many wells. It's loud. There's a lot of trucks. And so if I'm nearby, those would be my primary concerns. Knowing what I know, doing the work that I do, I wouldn't be concerned about a threat to my groundwater, to the air that I breathe, because I don't think fracking presents a threat to those resources. But the actual conduct of the hydraulic fracturing operation itself is intrusive. I don't think there's any way around it. But it's short term. It doesn't last that long. And so that would probably be my major concern.
This is the last one on local control issues. What is the legal process for local communities to have a say about where drilling should take place? What process should be followed?
That's a really interesting question. There is authority from the Colorado courts that an operator has to get a local permit. The operator can't just blow off the local community. If the local community has a set of land use regulations that require getting a special use permit in order to drill an oil and gas well, they've got to go get the special use permit. What that special use permit can require, what the land use regulations can cover, is a whole different question. And how far can land use be stretched to regulate all aspects or any aspects of the oil and gas operation? That's the critical question. But local governments do have authority. It's clear under the Bowen-Edwards case, they've got authority to regulate land use in connection with oil and gas. Land use is impact. I've heard it stated there are some lawyers who represent local governments who tend to say, well, local governments, communities can regulate everything above the ground, the Oil and Gas Commission regulates everything below the ground. It's way too simplistic. There are lots of things that happen above the ground that are technical in nature, that are integral part of the oil and gas activity, that are not land use, and should not be, under the existing rules, subject to regulation by local communities. The preemption standard is if the local community is regulating a technical area, a technical aspect that state rules govern, that's preempted. Or if the local community is preventing that which the state permits, that's preempted. But the case law also says that you need to be able to see whether there's a way to harmonize the two. You may be able to harmonize the local regulation with the state scheme, and that usually requires an evidentiary hearing, which means that you have to look at it, look at the local rule, and see if there's any way at all it can be reconciled and harmonized, coordinated with the state rule. That's exactly what's at issue right now in the Longmont litigation. There's actually two cases, as you probably know, in Longmont. One of them challenges many aspects of the Longmont ordinance, which regulates oil and gas, and the other challenges the fracking ban. And one of the issues in the first case, in the ordinance case, is going down section by section of the ordinance. Do you need an evidentiary hearing to determine whether that particular section can be reconciled and harmonized with state law? That's what the city's arguing, and judge has yet to decide. The state and the industry are arguing you can look at this and just, it's clear they regulate technical areas, or they restrict and prevent what the state would permit, therefore it's preempted on its face. So that's what the judge is going to be looking at in that case. In the fracking ban case, as I said before, to me it's pretty straightforward.
I said that was the last question on local issues, but it's not. Just got one more here with an interesting twist on it. Should communities be able to override a state regulatory agency? Okay, you've spoken on that. You said no in Colorado. What about a local government in New York State, for instance, that would want oil and gas development?
Well, look, first of all, you got to decide whether you're talking policy here or law. What I've been talking about primarily is law. Those are the decisions of the Colorado courts on preemption. Whether you agree that that should be the right policy is a whole different question. That's for our policymakers to decide, the extent to which local governments should have the ability to regulate or even ban oil and gas activity within their borders. Interestingly enough, Texas has no statewide oil and gas statute that prevents local governments from regulating the activity. So local communities in Texas can regulate pretty much to their heart's content. Some do, some don't. Attitudes in Texas are different than they are here, although you still see, conflicts develop. Here we have an Oil and Gas Conservation Act. We have a commission with this broad technical and operational authority, and so these preemption issues develop. But it's not, preordained that you have to have that kind of a state law. And that's why a statewide ballot initiative could change the law. Statewide ballot initiative could say local governments can do whatever they want. That's it. That controls. Preemption becomes a non-issue. Obviously, that would be a huge concern to industry and state government, but it could happen.
Why do mineral rights trump surface owner rights? Why do subsurface and mineral rights trump surface owner rights?
Well, there's an assumption in that question. They don't trump as such. It goes back to old common law days where the courts held that one who owns minerals and does not own the surface has an implied right to access his minerals by making reasonable use of the surface. Otherwise, the minerals could be locked away and you could never get at them. Over the years in this country, courts began to develop a limitation on that called the accommodation doctrine, that that the mineral owner had to reasonably accommodate surface owner in making use of the surface, if that were possible. And now in Colorado we have a statute that has actually codified that principle, the reasonable accommodation principle. And if you look at the case law, at least in Colorado, the court sort of talks about, you know, the estates of both are basically equal. Each is supposed to kind of have due regard for the interests of the other. When you use the word trump, I think really what you're saying is that ultimately, at the end of the day, the mineral owner can produce his minerals. And that's going to require some degree of disruption and disturbance of the surface. So if you want to call that a trump, I guess it's a trump. And of course, we're only talking about situations where the surface and the mineral estate ownership have diverged. If one property owner owns both the surface and the minerals, he's got total control over what can happen on his property.
It must feel to a surface owner like a trump.
Yeah.
Yeah. So back to your points about the subjectivity of this.
It's a power relationship,
Yeah.
no doubt.
Okay, so here are two closely related questions about the force of regulation in the improvement in industry conduct and behavior. Do you agree that one way to open a dialogue is to admit that many of the positive changes being made in oil and gas drilling is because of activism, including the stricter oil and gas regulations?
Absolutely. Yes.
No doubt engineers, similar spirit here, no doubt engineers can solve many problems. The issue is that without stricter regulations, the industry has no motivation to reduce emissions, ensure well casings will not degrade over time, etc. My question is, if the oil and gas industry refuses to disclose the content of fracking fluid, which is perhaps their trade secret, would you support a regulation that requires a tracer be put in the fracking fluid that could identify the drilling operator if that tracer turned up in someone's drinking water?
There's a lot of questions in there. On the tracer issue, yeah, I would ultimately support a measure to trace, to require a tracer if it turns out that that's the only way that you can reliably determine whether there's an impact. As I mentioned in my talk, there's some really interesting technological development on tracers that have some promise in really being able to identify more effectively what the source of potential contamination is. You know, tracers are imperfect technological devices. I don't know what their limitations are, so I'd want to know that before just simply requiring it. But basically, industry should be supportive of regulatory initiatives that are intended to determine whether or not they're affecting groundwater. And you know, we now require groundwater testing, which is intended to do just that.
Industry will not drill for oil and gas unless they find it economically viable. What is wrong with the idea that industry should pay for the full life cycle costs, including health costs, procedures to minimize greenhouse gases, and other costs to protect the population and the environment?
Look, nothing's wrong with requiring industry to pay the cost of its activity. Where the debate, I think, occurs is how do you determine what the impact of a particular well is on greenhouse gases. Yeah, you can talk about methane emissions, and that is being talked about, and there will be a lot of work done with that over the next months and years to try to identify the extent to which it's a problem and deal with it. But people differ over what are the actual impacts. And that's where I think the discussion gets a lot tougher. It's hard to argue with the statement that industry should pay for the impacts it causes. But how you measure those impacts, how you quantify them, what impacts you're talking about, that's a subject of real dispute. They've got to be realistic. There's got to be a link. There's got to be some causation between the activity and the impact. So I can't just agree with the broad statement. I can agree that industry ought to pay or mitigate its impacts.
If the industry is so well regulated, how come the Denver area does not meet the Clean Air Act quality? Why is it high in ozone and other pollutants? Why does it not meet this?
I think there's a disconnect in that statement. You know, we're talking about air regulation, which involves lots of different sources and lots of different factors, of which oil and gas activity is one. And so the fact that Denver may be in non-attainment says nothing about the extent to which the oil and gas industry is regulated. The oil and gas industry is regulated in lots of different ways that have actually nothing to do with air, and they're regulated with respect to their air emissions. So you can argue about whether that regulation is adequate and should be changed. Fair point. And we're going to see that play out in the next few months as the Air Pollution Control Division of the Health Department conducts a rulemaking on new emission standards. But to say that because Denver is in a non-attainment status, if it is, the industry is unregulated, there's no connection there.
No connection?
No connection. I said it. I stand by it.
Correlation, not causation? Oh, okay. Okay, sorry. I'm not reading from my remarks here. I got a little spontaneous there, but
It's okay.
I'm back. Okay, so these are two kind of large-scale questions about regulation in the state. And you said this was probably written before you made some remarks, but if you want to kind of accent what you mean by tough and how you would gauge toughness and effectiveness, please rate Colorado's oil and gas regulations compared to the rest of the United States in terms of their strength. 1 equals low, 10 equals high. Do we have tough laws in Colorado?
Colorado's a 10. Colorado's an 11. I mean, there's no other state that's close to Colorado in what we do here. There's no other state that has anything like this system. The only thing that remotely approaches it is the federal government system, and the federal government owns the minerals, so they can pretty much do what they want on their own minerals. We're talking the state regulatory system that governs what private owners can do with their property. So there's really nothing like Colorado's system anywhere.
What makes a good, with the accent on the word, the meaning of the word good, what makes a good rule to address conditions statewide and to consider and accommodate for recognized technological change in that picture?
Could you repeat the question?
Good. What constitutes, what makes a good rule that would address conditions statewide and also consider technological change? And then recognize, I guess, that it's a moving target, that it's not, it's a dynamic situation, technology. So how do you frame a good rule when things are dynamic and changing, and also to be one size fits all and to cover the whole state?
It's kind of a hard question to answer. You know, in the rulemaking, that's always an issue. The agency will propose a rule, and the question will be, well, does that rule, which maybe fits really great in the Piceance Basin, should that be applied in the Denver Basin, where you've got all this, the conditions are different, you got all these wells, got all this data. So there's always arguments about whether a particular rule fits everywhere, whether it's one size fits all, whether you should modify it or not even apply it in this area, only apply it in that area. You have to look at the merits of the particular rule. It's always an issue. I think it's fair to say that most of the stakeholders that participate in these rulemakings recognize that there are differing conditions around the state that require different approaches.
Okay, a couple of specific things, and then we're heading into the summing up kinds of ones over here. Do a lot of the pros of gas development, reduced CO2 emission, reduced air pollution, change if most of the hydrocarbon production you're fracking is oil instead of gas, as in North Dakota and the Denver Basin?
Well, that's an interesting question. That goes to what I was talking about near the end of my talk, kind of, you know, what your perception is of the merits of the shale development and the virtues of all this ramped up oil production. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? You know, it has a lot of tremendous economic benefits, you know, energy policy benefits, foreign policy, all that stuff. But if your feeling is that all it's doing is keeping us dependent on oil to fuel our transportation system and keeping us from developing new sources of energy that are carbon free, then you see it as a bad thing. And so, North Dakota sees it basically as a good thing. They have now exceeded the million barrel a day production level. Their economy is booming. There's no unemployment in the state. But there aren't a lot of people in the state. The criteria there are different than they are here. But I think if you talk to most citizens of North Dakota, they'd say, this is fantastic. We couldn't have dreamed for this. But there's a lot of people who have legitimate concerns that this is a bad thing for America, for society, and that we need to get on with the transition. And, I think that there needs to be a transition. I just don't think it's going to happen overnight, and I think you're going to have oil development, and I'm glad to see that we've got it here in this country. I just hope that it's not used as an excuse to sort of stop working on everything else. And in that regard, I'll just say, and I've gotten in trouble with this in the past, industry should be supporting extension of the tax credit for wind development. I mean, to me, it's just sort of a no-brainer. And yet, you do see industry in opposition in Washington to that extension, and I don't understand it. Industry ought to be partnering with renewable energy, especially on the natural gas side, and not seeing it as an adversary.
With all of the drilling, why are oil prices, our gasoline prices, still above $3 per gallon? Gasoline was $1.50 when drilling boom began in 2001. So why all this oil production and gasoline prices still high?
I think gasoline prices are pretty low, actually, comparatively, certainly compared to other parts of the world, but compared to what they've been in the U.S. And, what are you comparing it to? I mean, when I was a kid, a gallon of gas was 20 cents, 25 cents. I'm dating myself. But, in recent times, we've seen gasoline go well above $4. It's now in the low threes, and the price of a barrel of oil worldwide has come down. There's an oversupply. Those things go up and down, and we don't really have control here in Colorado over those geopolitical factors. But I think basically the price of oil is pretty low in comparison to certainly other parts of the world. The price of gasoline.
You said that stopping oil and gas operations would be devastating to Colorado's economy. According to Colorado industry statistics, oil and gas operations constitute 1.8% of the state's jobs and 0.62% of the gross state product. How do you think this would be devastating if the state ceased oil and gas extraction? Well, I don't think those statistics, I don't know where those statistics came from. I've looked at the CU study, a variety of groups. The Metro Denver Chamber just came out with a study about how huge an impact the oil and gas industry has on the state. So some of it depends on, how you use statistics and what you get your data from. But I think the studies that I've seen indicate that it's a pretty major industry in the state, a pretty major economic driver. So I should just add that Rich Boigon at the School of Business, who's one of our great pals and a faculty affiliate of the Southern American West, he is just launching on a study of that. So we hope at some point to have him speak, and he's a credible and interesting and down-to-earth person. So we'll be back on that question. Those who ever asked that question come back to hear Rich Boigon. Are companies 100% responsible if something goes wrong health-wise?
Well, that's sort of the big issue, isn't it? We have a lot of law in this country. It's called nuisance law and trespass law. tort law. If you conduct an activity on your property that injures your neighbor, you can be sued. Your neighbor can get damages for the harm you cause. If you pollute his well, if you destroy vegetation on his surface, if you injure somebody on his property, you can be sued. So, that's basic tort law. That's just, a basic legal system in this country. If you cause injury to somebody, you can be sued. You can be held accountable for that. The oil and gas industry is no different. So it's just a question of proving causation. What harm are you talking about? And can you link that harm with that activity? And if you can, yeah, you can recover for it.
A couple of questions about this. In some ways, this might be something again that you did get to after the question was written, but what should academia be doing to address public concerns? You did speak of the 2 studies.
The studies that we're talking about, certainly, I think that's critical. Everybody's got studies, and you're seeing more and more studies come out. You're seeing more and more reports. There have been recommendations that there be funding established to conduct comprehensive studies, that industry, participate in that funding. So I think there's certainly a huge role for academics here.
Not maybe just scientists, but social scientists and humanities people in this. Humanities? Did I hear you want to say something about the value of the humanities?
In particular,
I'm about to go there. And
I'd say historians.
Oh, don't you think?
For sure. Yeah.
Well, that's a wonderful answer. Which brings us to a rather...
law school professors.
That's not what we call the humanities here, but...
No, we're talking academics.
Yeah, good.
They qualify.
They do indeed, they're totally academics, yeah. Rather personal question, but we ask all the questions here. What is your billing rate?
It depends on who's asking.
Well, yeah, right. And there's an interesting second question, which kind of presumes the first one answered. Why is it so low? And is it flexible? So there we are. We ask all the questions.
See me after the...
Okay.
We'll talk.
Okay, and then this is to us. Our podcast available on our website. And the answer, Kurt Gutjahr, our managing director over there, is nodding, so the answer is yes. Then the last ones here are about, mostly about industry's conduct. Why has industry consistently kept lawsuits on fracking under wraps by non-disclosure agreements rather than being more transparent, which might improve their image? George King from Apache Energy, who spoke here, blames this situation on the lawyers who demand non-disclosure. What is their billing rate? That's
interesting question. It's sort of I think it's a standard provision in these kinds of disputes when somebody's alleging that you've done something wrong, that you don't want them going around and telling everybody, yeah, I got, $3 million from whoever to settle this case, and you don't want them disparaging you. You sort of bought their silence by paying them. I guess that's the thinking. I recognize there's an issue there. It looks a lot like, you are muzzling somebody and you're paying them for the privilege. So that person has to decide, is the money more important than being able to speak out and say what happened to me or what I think. Yeah, it's probably the lawyers, but the clients also, figure that they don't want that person, if they're going to pay them money, they don't want that person continuing to disparage them. I'm not really going to try to justify it. It's seen as a basic business tactic.
What is the oil and gas industry doing to get out of the foxhole when it comes to public outreach?
Really, that's the whole essence of my talk. I think things are a lot better than they were. I mean, I was very active 20 years ago during all that uproar in Weld County, and things were pretty lively. Industry had a lot to answer for. They were not nearly as responsible, sensitive. Stakeholder issues were sort of not on their radar screen. I will say that in Colorado, we've come a long way, and probably farther than some other states, in sensitizing industry, educating them. I mean, look, they're business people. They recognize that it's in their own best business interest to be good citizens and to be trusted and to have people not, shooting at them all the time. They just want to be able to conduct their business. What I tell people is, at the end of the day, what industry really wants is they want the ability to control their costs, and they want certainty. They need to know what permits do they need, how do they get them, what will be their requirements, what will be the conditions on the permits, what do I have to do, how long is it going to take, so I can plan. And you tell them all that and you stick to it, they can deal with it. If they don't have certainty, they can't figure out when they can get their permit, if ever, and what the conditions are going to be and how much it's going to cost them. They can't do business, they can't plan. And with the larger companies, Colorado competes in capital investment decisions with all the other projects that these companies have. And you got upper management saying, well, why should we be spending money in Colorado with all these uncertainties when we can go to Texas, North Dakota, and we don't have any of these issues, or at least the issues are different. I forgot where I was going with that, but the cost issue.
Oh, so yeah, what our oil and gas industry is doing to get out of the foxhole and.
So to get out of the foxhole, sorry, I lost my train of thought. Industry basically came to the table because they needed to. There was too much challenge to their ability to operate if they didn't. But they also kind of began to understand what they need to do. It wasn't all just, they're people, they're not like evil demons. They're actually good people. And yeah, they're business people and they want to make a profit and they want to do things as cheaply as they can, but they're decent people. So they're not just trying to do bad things to people, to the world at large. So anyway, it's a rambling answer. Industry is a lot more responsive than they used to be.
What areas should be exempted from drilling? What should the boundaries be, and how should those be identified?
You can't answer that question in the abstract. All I can say is that I believe that there are areas that shouldn't be drilled, and I think that should include residential areas in cities. And that's a big statement. Not everybody in industry would agree with that statement. But increasingly in this society, oil and gas development is not compatible with residential development. There are tons of places on the Front Range in Weld County of wells in subdivisions. And the irony to a lot of that is, in many cases, development is not compatible with residential development. There are tons of places on the Front Range in Weld County of wells in subdivisions. And the irony to a lot of that is, in many cases, the subdivision's built up to the wells. You have wells there that may have been out sort of in the middle of nowhere, subdivisions developed. And we talk about 500-foot setbacks. Well, there aren't those same kinds of restrictions in terms of how closely to a well a developer can build a house. So you've got a lot of situations where houses get built right up to the edges, very close to existing wells. In fact, making it difficult to get in and even service those wells. So to say that there should never be wells in residential areas, well, there are lots of wells in and around Weld County and other places in the state in and around residential areas. So I'm not going to make the blanket statement that you should never have a well in a residential area, but it's a very sensitive area. Should be subject to close scrutiny. There should be, significant restrictions, significant protections. And that's just an example. I mean, there's lots of other sensitive surface uses. And then, of course, there's constant conflict about environmental issues and where should wells be drilled and not be drilled based on environmental considerations, wildlife considerations, whatever. So you can't really answer the question in the abstract. You've got interest groups on both sides that fight that battle.
And this last question is mine, which is to ask you to reflect a little bit on what representing municipalities, surface owners, what that experience has added up to in your reflections and thoughts and perspectives and angles on this issue. Had you only represented oil and gas industry people, companies, where would you have landed with that, and how has your engagement with these other groups, how has that shaped and shifted your perspective?
Clearly, you have a much better understanding of other points of view. Representing a landowner, vis-a-vis an operator, it gives you a whole different perspective, of course, of what are the kinds of protections that you as a landowner should have, and what can you ask of the operator. I have a pretty good sense of what operators will generally agree to, but I think it really helps to understand what the perspectives are of everybody else who's impacted by oil and gas activity. So representing local government, same thing. And there you've got all the other stakeholders, all the constituents, citizens who have their points of view on, what's important for that community, and you have to try to help them achieve their objectives. I think every lawyer should have that kind of range of representation, just to keep you so you just understand the issues.
Great. Well, ladies and gentlemen, join me in thanking our speakers.